Hello everyone, is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another. What if Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction? Beerus has been erased because of the mistake Goku, but he encountered the fathers of all angels. He is in a new world field of gods. What will happen to our former G.O.D?
The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 24, The Titanomachy 17. It all happened so fast, before any of Styx children could react, numerous sprays and gushes of golden blood and shredded guts flying around in a circle as each of their bodies were rent. The sharp edge of heavenly metal slicing through their limbs, waists and necks in multiple swift motions of brutal efficiency that took but an insignificant speck of time to perform, dismembering the four deities in an instant. Looks of pained shock plastered on their faces, as their body parts dropped away in a shower of gold-misted gore. Stood at the center of that garish act, spear now firmly in his grip again and dripped in his children's blood, was the now ascended Pallas. His entire form bereft of clothing, shimmering magenta red all over his muscular form, irises gone as his sclera glowed an ethereal, light mauvish crimson shade that pulsed outward with his fury that had been released. Have fun, children. His distorted voice spat out down at the falling, dismembered bodies of his repulsive spawn. The Titan feeling a visceral sense of satisfaction at finally shutting him up, as his attention soon snapped over to Kronos and Zeus. The latter of which was quick enough, and wise enough after feeling the ascension, to call upon the power of his thunderbolt. His form vanishing away from his spot in a swift, fleeting bolt of shimmering blue lightning just in the nick of time, before Pallas' divine spear stabbed into place where he'd been. Of course, the Titan saw the thunderbolt go, and scoffed as he watched the younger god flee. The ascended Titan cared not for the failure to strike his opponent, however, as the nuisance of a deity was out of the way all the same, so it hardly mattered to him. He didn't fail to notice the way that several of the deities, namely Prometheus and Epimetheus, as well as the previously invisible deity and the god with the trident, had all pulled back instantly as well. All of them leaving their prior positions on the battlefield behind to hug much closer to the mountain, rather than continue their fights with his allies and father, or even attempt to attack him. Maggots, the whole lot of them. He ignored them in favor of immediately zoning in on the ones that hadn't yet. That being Themis, alongside the two goddesses who'd been helping her to fight Atlas. And from his discernment, the only reason the latter still held true, seemingly, was because the general of their ranks had taken advantage of the distraction by his transformation, and managed to grab hold of the two younger ones. The Titan keeping them locked in place into his powerful body, with his massive arms hooking deep into their necks. It was all in super slow motion for him, how Themis was attempting to break them free, in what he could make out as being their first proper sign of desperation, by slashing at him with her sword, in an attack that he was sure Atlas would either evade, or counter in some fashion. The other one who didn't, caught his attention and interest far more, however, and made him promptly ignore that struggle as well. For when he took notice of Styx, his now ex-consort, who had Thea pinned to the mountain, and seemed to not be paying him much mind, the Titan son of Creos simply couldn't help himself. He let his boiling rage envelop him further, and put everything else on hold temporarily, as he shot down toward his ex-consort like a plane dive-bombing toward another. Given his perception of time was now far beyond anyone else's on the battlefield currently, Pallas easily zipped down past the cowardly gods who'd backed away upon his ascension. All of which were basically frozen in time from his perspective, and appeared behind the only deity there outside his children who'd personally earned his wrath. Mind if I cut in? He sneered balefully, not giving Styx a chance to respond while holding Thea down, before his divinely lit spear stabbed into her back and burst right out through her abdomen, as he grabbed her by the back of her head, and pulled her away from his ally. Styx barely had the time to cough out ichor as her lifeblood spilt out from the wound delivered through her torso and piercing through her intestines. As well as dripped out from the tip of Pallas' spear, before the latter roughly wrenched her head to the side. His mauvish crimson sclera boring down into her dark brown pools, as she managed a spiteful glare of her own right back. The children are out of the picture for now, dear. He spoke the word mockingly, hiding none of his contempt. So, how about you and me get reacquainted? In that instant, he felt a swell of power in his former consort, and knew she was attempting to access her true divine form despite the pain she was clearly in. She never got the chance to do so though, before Pallas brutally yanked his spear out from her gaping belly hard enough to rip out chunks of her shredded intestines out her back in a spout of blood. That grievous wound wasn't given the time to even begin healing, before Pallas aimed, and with a sense of sadistic satisfaction, rammed his divine spear directly up her ass with savage force. The spear tip and shaft shunting and shredding through flesh and arteries alike until the tip tore through her rectum and shoved out her mouth in one single, swift motion with a blood-spitting squelch. Her ichor spilling, agonized gags as she wetly choked on her own life fluids and the divine spear's shaft. Blood pooling out from both ends, dyeing her tunic a further shade of dirty gold, as her back end leaked it down over the balled fist of Pallas holding the weapon and pressed into her clothed rear. Pallas paid a small moment of attention to the wide, pained eyes she held along with her gargling noises of torment, and savored it for as much as he could, as his glowing pools watched her ichor spill from both ends. A brief look of smugness fusing with the rage painted over his features, as his lips peeled back for a barbaric, toothy grin. Ah, my dear Styx, this brings back some fonder memories, I must say. You always were more pleasant to deal with when you were choking on my shaft. The Titan couldn't help the small chuckle at the murderous glare that innuendo earned him, or the choked, gurgling noise that sounded eerily close to a "fuck you." All as her body futilely wriggled and spasmed about along the impaled spear, as though trying to tear herself away from it. It was almost cute, in his eyes. Still, as fun as it would be to put you in your place further, I have more pressing matters to get to, so I'll come back and continue with you later. He suddenly spoke coldly, as then, without missing a beat, he ripped the entire spear out, not from where it entered, but brutishly out the back of her, with a sickening crunch and squelch as both bone and flesh were rent and torn asunder. Her whole spine, part of her pelvis, and a section of her skull getting broken and wrenched out her body in a sickening display of spraying blood, with multiple chunks of flesh, organs and brain matter clinging to it and the spear. All as the flesh and skin from head to ass was ripped in twine with a horrific gash so deep, it left a perfect, gory view of her minced insides all the way to the front of her inner body. Tossing her now limp body away as it continued to spout blood, now with her full spine dangling outside of her, Pallas gave Thea a once-over as his former consort plummeted away from him, ravaged body bouncing brutally off the mountain's hide as she went. The Titan getting a brief, if annoyed nod of thanks from the Titaness, before he quickly turned his attention back to Kronos, and flashed over to him. Not a single god being able to intercept him along the way, as he appeared before his lord's side. Lord Kronos, the Titan god of battle and warcraft, began with a loud bark of impatience that everyone in the skies and on the mountain heard. His mauvish crimson eyes glaring down at the Titan lord as he came to his side. I think it is time we stopped holding ourselves back and fooling around with these rebels. I beseech you to send out your scyther's strike one more time, and I shall follow through personally and ensure that barrier of theirs becomes no more. Kronos narrowed his eyes instantly at the sheer impudence of the lesser god ignoring his expressed order, and the tone with which he took with him. The wording he used having the undeniable tinge of a demand to it, despite the way he'd attempted to phrase it. The Titan Lord almost felt the desire to castigate the buffoon severely for his arrogance, but he stayed his tongue for the moment, as he quickly considered the situation they were now in. He knew not to overreach in this situation, for rightful concern of the Hecatonchia's absence and the role, most likely an ambush, that they'd play, and thus had not wanted to come in with such intensity as to have him and his strongest in ascended form. As such brashness could very well lead to a swift defeat, where they were all taken out and lost the war there and then. That being said, however, it was clear that such a tactic was always to remain temporary, until they had a better idea of what exactly they were dealing with. Kronos had been mulling over how to go about that since before the battle had truly started, but now, thanks to Pallas' hastiness and complete ignorance of the danger he was very likely in without knowing it, the younger Titan had just handed him the solution on a silver platter. A useful idiot that could be used to spring their enemy's potential trap, and in the process, at maximum, only really sacrifice one of his more powerful allies, who in himself, was not as valuable as his brothers, sister, or second in command by any stretch. If the trap was as horrendous as his mind predicted, then Pallas would for sure fall, but the upside of getting the opposition to be forced to tip their hand completely, and show him their hidden trump card, was simply too good to pass up. He'd have to be a fool not to see that. Very well, Pallas. He nodded, garnering a pleased expression from the younger god at being listened to. Be ready on my mark. The task of breaking through their defenses, I shall rest on your shoulders. Meanwhile, as all that was going on, Zeus' form had zipped back down with a flash of lightning right next to his consort upon Mount Olympus, crouched down on a knee. A quick exhale being released from the close call he'd had, even preempting such an attack before the Titan's transformation had been completed, with the ludicrous speed boost it had offered him. Metis was kneeling by his side in an instant, her relief showing clear as day on her attractive features, as she laid a hand on his shoulder supportively. It is good to have you back in one piece, Zeus. An infinitesimal moment longer and I fear you wouldn't have been whisked away in time. Yeah. That was a bit too close for comfort. The sliver-haired deity agreed, as he looked over to his lover. A smirk drawing unto his bearded features, as he regarded her. Hey, if there's already a goddess out there presiding over luck, I'd say I've well curried favor with her somehow, to have narrowly escaped that situation unscathed. I honestly thought for that fleeting moment there that I'd be zipping back here with a gaping hole in my torso big enough for you to be going inside me for a change. Metis notably did not appreciate his attempt at levity, and markedly ignored his assumption of such a hypothetical deity she had yet heard of as being female. This is not the time for jesting, Zeus. Had Pallas struck you and left you open, there'd have been nothing stopping Kronos from finishing you off afterwards. Permanently. She emphasized with a narrowing of her beautiful eyes, managing to sound scolding yet sexy at the same time in his mind. I hardly believe such a time as this is one for you to be making such a crass joke, given I could have potentially lost you there. Zeus at least had the decency to look sheepish at that. Right. My apologies. Perhaps that was not the best time to be making light of what nearly occurred, he said earnestly, as his hand snaked behind Metis' head and brought her lips forward into his for a brief, but passionate kiss that despite her best efforts, the Oceanid found herself almost melting into. Her nerves that she'd been doing a great job of hiding up to now being calmed by Zeus's forceful, but comforting liplock that decreased the tension in her shoulders, and would have brought out a moan had he not broke away from it almost as quick as he'd initiated it. Once we've sent my father and his allies scurrying away, I'll be sure to properly apologize in full for my inconsiderate speech in our bedroom, if you don't mind. This time, Metis did let out a chuckle, as she began to turn away. Cheeks tinting pink as she rose back to her feet. Honestly, leave it up to you to bring this back to sex. I'm starting to think your mind is a little too perverse for its own good. Zeus let out an honest, good-natured laugh back, as he pushed himself back to his feet as well, towering over the shorter goddess easily, as he snaked an arm around her shoulders. Perhaps it is so. I'd consider that a part of my charm though. After all, I've yet to get any complaints from you on the matter. Metis just shook her head at that in bemusement. I once again find myself wondering what I'm going to do with you. Her eyes then focused in on the blood-red glow that began to emerge in the distance, which was not coming from Pallas. Her expression immediately hardening. In any case, better to focus on the now, rather than later. Pallas is after tearing through his own kin and my sister, and I have no doubt he'll be coming alongside Cronus coming attack to tear through our barrier too. Right. Of course. Zeus nodded again, his own countenance turning much more serious than before, as his eyes shot forth past the barrier, and saw his father in the distance preparing another swing of his scythe. The weapon already raised above his head, coated in a malicious, dark red aura. And that shall be his own undoing. They were not the only ones who'd taken notice of the current situation. For when Kronos howled out at now, and swung his scythe down, sending an arc of blood-red energy hurtling toward the barrier at high speed, almost all other activity seemed to pause as everyone watched Pallas ready his spear. During this small moment though, Atlas, who'd managed to keep both Demeter and Hestia in one-armed, rear-naked chokes, while halting a particular blade attack from Themis at his front with his teeth, was able to notice something despite the trio of goddesses' attempts to keep him preoccupied. None of the group is even attempting to stop Lord Kronos and Pallas. After going through the effort to stop me the first time, are they really about to let that attack succeed? The towering titan thought to himself in increasing befuddlement, as he watched his king's attack rapidly approach its target, with not a single soul making to intercept it, as stupid as that would be, or transforming themselves into their ascended state to stonewall Chris's son. It would be too late by the time he figured out why, as Cronus' attack struck home, crashing into the barrier with a THOOM. A heavy shockwave blasting out from the point of impact as the barrier once again was cracked and fragmented with devastating damage. A heavy burst of wind coming with it that blew out and made the hair on his and Themis' heads whip and wave in the screeching air. Zeus's and Metis did too, as both stood waiting, and sure enough, just as the barrier began to heal, a battle cry rang out as the tip of a spear coated in magenta aura pierced right through the brittle barrier wall. The force, spreading out in a red wave that crossed over the entirety of the magical dome, before in an instant, and with the sound of shattered glass, the Olympian side's seemingly strongest defense was utterly destroyed before everyone's eyes. The dome-shaped wall of magic disappearing with flickers and fragments of gold, as in its weakened state, it was unable to endure the thrust from the now savagely grinning Pallas, who glared down at the two. And the barrier is no more, he proclaimed victoriously, eyes alight with delight as he regarded the only two visible opponents. Any more cheap tricks left to try, little ones? Styx, who'd managed to latch onto the hide of the mountain further down after being tossed away in a gory heap, was able to view this all from her position as her wounds were still healing as she hung from a hand. Her bones roughly mending and fixing themselves into place within her body, alongside mended tissue and ruined organs. Her crumpled tunic, doused heavily in her blood, barely clinging wetly to her front and maintaining some form of modesty as the back part was torn open. Her life fluid dripped down from her feet to the great ground far below, with her in quite the vulnerable position, as the opening at her back which showed the steadily healing gash from her skull to her pale, shapely rump threatened to have the saturated tunic fall off at any moment. Something that'd leave her more exposed than she already was, with how it barely stuck over her swaying, sizable breasts to begin with, dangling around by her wide, bare hips, and would take little more than a wrong tilt to have it simply flutter off uselessly, fully revealing herself in a manner not fit for a battlefield. However, she didn't give a damn if it did or not in that moment. For despite the pain still filling her being from Pala's attack, and the potential embarrassment that may come with her being made nude like that, she grinned to herself as blood continued drooling from her lips. Her voice coming out equal parts spiteful and mocking as she let out a gurgled laugh, knowing what was about to happen, and eagerly looking forward to her oafish ex-consort being the first to taste what was to come. Oh, my dear Pallas, you truly are such a fool. No, not really. Back up top, Zeus was the one to reply amusedly to the Titan that'd nearly go red him. His grin being enough to give Pallas pause, as there was clearly not even a hint of fear or concern for their mountain's shield getting dealt with in the god's features or voice. Almost as if keeping it maintained for the battle's duration had never been a true concern. Although, a bit of advice, if you'll indulge me, Zeus' teeth shone out almost like a feral predator, and though Metis was more composed, even her expression gave way to a raptorial glare. You might want to watch your side. Ha! Pallas' confusion shone through, as he readied his weapon for another attack. Watch my side. What kind of? Boom! The spear-wielding Titan's eyes barely had time to widen, both in shock, and in unimaginable pain, as within an instant so small and fleeting that no mortal scientists in any future era would be able to measure, his luminescent frame was struck. His body bent and heavenly bones shattering against a dense, rocky surface. His aura and radiance overshadowed and outright swallowed in by a huge blur of dark grayish blue of what smashed into him, as he and it were sent careening off into the distance, far, far away from Olympus. All with nary but a small spray of ichor left behind to scatter in the wind in front of Zeus and Metis, as the Titan didn't even get the chance to scream. Within Beerus's chambers. Whoa! Hera gasped in shock, as everything around her violently shook, her prone body almost bumped off the bed that she laid on as harsh tremors shook and rattled it. The goddess involuntarily squeezing Beerus's head and face deeper into her billowing, jiggling cleavage as her toes subconsciously curled into the sheets. Things must definitely be picking up out there if everything's starting to shake like this. Noosh, she heard and felt the purple-haired god groan, even in unconsciousness, into her soft, perky boob flesh, as the quaking seemed to disturb him on an instinctual level. Hera's cheeks then flushing quite the shade of pinkers, possibly on that same subconscious way of identifying things, believed her to be his body-sized pillow or something, as his arms wrapped around her waist all of a sudden. His face beginning to nuzzle into her mushrooming breasts to find a more comfortable position for his head to rest on its pillow, before he rolled them both unto their sides. The action leaving one of his legs beneath hers while the other hooked around her outside pillar of femininity, as he cuddled up as close as he could to her. Despite some embarrassment, Hera made no attempt to correct their new, certainly more intimate-looking position. Demeter would no doubt throw an absolute fit when she eventually came back and saw this. Especially given he was somehow still erect, and his clothed, protruding tool was now wedged between her inner thighs, pushing out the other side by her perfectly round rear and less than an inch away from touching up against her sex. Figures, you'd only be this forward when you're fast asleep, Hera muttered in amusement. The more aggressive, and admittedly sexually charged side of her that she kept in check, loving the amount of ammunition she'd have now for teasing him to death. For she could only imagine how Beerus himself would react to his own body willingly cuddling up and being one step away from outright spooning with her, if her older sister didn't end up tearing her away from him and he woke up like this. Back outside. What in the name of Tartarus? Atlas, and indeed, the eyes of every Titan, even Cronus, widened in shock. All in disbelief as they saw the scar that had been rent through the sky from whatever had just struck Pallas, with the very space itself looking crumpled and cut like wet paper from the crash site, all the way back in the other direction. I knew it. Kronos thought immediately. More alert than ever before as his gaze shot over to get a better look at the spot where Pallas and the object had crashed into on the earth below, where the land itself had been obliterated under the force of the collision. A crater so incomprehensibly deep and vast, having formed in the epicenter of thousands of kilometers of his mother's fragmented earth, that Kronos dared not think of just how far down it went from the surface. Pallas. He heard his brother Krios scream out gutturally in worry over his boy, but Kronos cared little for the fate that had just befallen his brother's son. His bait. For if the younger Titan had not been utterly felled by that attack, it'd take him some time to crawl his way out of the abyss that had been formed by that powerful, earth-smashing object. And in any case, he had served his purpose well regardless. That was definitely them, Kronos murmured to himself. While the object had come far too fast for this form of his to perceive, Kronos could feel the overwhelming power radiating out from the crash site, the likes of which few gods could hope of standing against. And it was one he knew all too well, despite it having been many millenniums since he'd last felt it. One he could never forget after witnessing it himself, before deciding that those who wielded it would be far too dangerous to keep around, and had to be caged. Thea, who'd been about to fly up as soon as she saw the barrier break completely, snapped her shocked gaze down the mountain, where her ears could just barely pick up the laughter of Styx, which was becoming less and less gargled by the second. Their eyes meeting over the lengthened distance, and that was when the Titaness was struck with an immediate epiphany that she hadn't yet considered. They wanted us to destroy the barrier. She realized, quite like Atlas, far too late. Her teeth gritting down hard in anger, and admittedly fear, as she chanced to look out in the direction where that speeding object had been hurled from, going by the crumpled spacetime left in its wake, and saw how far down and out the point of origination was. The next stage of her enemy's plan clicking in her mind then and there, as she knew of only 3 beings capable of such power outside of them at their peak, who had yet been unaccounted for. Those conniving bastards. The destruction of the barrier, it was a signal for the Hecatonchias to start attacking us from range. Back on Crete, in that moment. Ha! Perfect shot. Briareus proclaimed with a jubilant laugh, as his brothers hollered too. All of them clutching into 100 more boulders, one in each hand still. Practically sent that puny prick into mother's bowels with that one. Hey! I certainly hope not, brother. I really don't think mother would appreciate having that twerp anywhere close to that part of her. Cottus barked with a laugh of his own, knowing well his brother wasn't all that serious, as he followed that throw up with one of his own. one of his many arms swinging upwards and sending his own aura-infused boulder soaring high up in the air, breaking past the clouds and crumpling spacetime as well as it went ahead. With the angle though, it'd only be able to hit one of them on its way falling back down, losing much of its momentum. Kotis knew this though, as did his brothers upon seeing his boulder fly high into the heavens, up past the stilled, stunned titans without them noticing. The boulder aimed specifically for a certain brother of theirs, for when it fell down, that had a mean ass-kicking coming to him for a long time now. In saying that though, let's see how that little shit up there reacts to this one. Back near Olympus. Father. You and your Titan ilk may want to brace yourselves, because if you thought that by simply breaking our barrier you'd gain an advantage, think again. Zeus bellowed out with a thunderous voice charged with passion, lightning licking off the corners of his pupils as his thunderbolt seemed to light up with vigor beside him. Pallas was but the first to go, for if you do not flee whilst you still have the chance, you and yours will be flattened all the same. Damn it. Brother, the destruction of the barrier was a part of their plan all along. Its obliteration has done nothing other than act as the signal that the Hecatonchias were waiting for to reveal themselves and attack us from range. Thea screamed out in partial panic despite knowing they'd come into play at some point, and partial hope that her younger brother would come up with a way to counter this, as she saw his attention partially shoot her way. Her finger hastily pointing down in perturbation to where she could just about make out where the first of what was sure to be many more projectiles originated from. It came from down there. How do we? Kronos. The Titan King's attention instantly snapped over to his brother Iapetus a ways away from him, and even from this distance, he could see just as much as hear the alarm he held as he screamed out to him while pointing upward. Look out from above you. The wind whistled harshly in his ears then, as he immediately felt a shadow be cast over him from above. His head snapped up then, and eyes widened like saucers as they were met with the underbelly of an enormous boulder just as tall, and 3 times as wide as his normal Titan size falling towards him. One coated with the same immensely monstrous, divine aura he'd felt from the one that had just slammed into Pallas. Shit. The current king of the universe cursed, swinging up his scythe hastily and imbuing it with as much power as he could in a panic. And where any other weapon would have simply broken into pieces upon contact with the aura-bolstered boulder, Kronos' weapon did as it always did. Its primordial, destructive magic managing to, with more effort than usual, pierce right through the thickly dense aura around the huge rock, the sharp tip of his weapon stabbing deep into the earthy hide. And then with a quick pulse of blood-red energy, both the aura surrounding it and the boulder itself shattered into pieces, much to his relief, and fell all around him in harmless chunks of stone. That relief, however, did not last long. As no sooner had Kronos dispatched that one, than to his horror, he saw hundreds more suddenly dropping right after from further up. Their heavy forms bursting through the clouds like meteors of death, poised to rain down and squash all that were in their way from varying heights. Their slowed speed compared to the one that had felled Pallas but a small mercy in comparison to the threat they posed. Boulders from above. The Titan Lord screamed out in alarm, bringing his remaining allies' attention to the plummeting balls of earth, which were undeniably being hurled by the Hecatonchias. Don't let yourselves be hit by them. Dodge out of their way now. None of his Titan brothers needed to be told twice. For as soon as they noticed the dive-bombing, aura-infused boulders coming towards them, they along with him all sprang into action, doing the damn best to swerve, bob and weave their way around the falling boulders turned meteors of doom. The 4 forced to dance to the rhythm that the Hecatonchias had set for them, lest they be squashed. The loud THOOM and bang of each boulder avoided slamming hard and cratering down on the earth below, heard by all, as the whole world below seemingly shook and the ground became progressively more perforated. No matter how fast they all evaded though, there was a limit to how fast they could move in their base states. And it didn't take long for their reflexes in base to not be good enough, for as Krios and Koyos avoided a particular boulder together, both were accosted by another on either end, and only a hasty torque of their bodies spared their entire frame from being squished. It did not, however, stop them from getting clipped on their shoulder and leg respectively, and the wet, garish sound of muscles, flesh, tendons and bones being swiftly and gruesomely torn apart reaching everyone's ears, as did their howls of pain. Fuck. Both brothers cursed at the top of their lungs, barely getting time to glance at what remained, with but a chunk of a bone jutting out a gnarled shoulder and upper thigh, as the entire arm and the rest of the leg of either had been ripped off in an instant. Ichor spewing copiously from the ghoulish stumps as it bits of flesh dangled disgustingly from the remains of where the rest of the limb of either titan had been. The shadows of coming stony stars snapping them back to reality despite the pain and shock, got back to avoiding the shunting boulders as fast as possible. Their wounds already in the process of beginning to heal, but that process really couldn't come fast enough now. Iapetus got it worse though, for but a minor error in judgment as his flying body swerved around one, then two, then three of the plummeting boulders brought him directly in the path of a fourth. This time, however, the distance between them was hardly even an inch, and the Titan could feel the unrelenting force over his divine skin before it struck, and the intense goosebumps it garnered all over his body, as with a look of panic, he veered as far away to the side as he could. The preciously short time he was given there not enough to avoid it, as it clipped down on his leg all the way up to his pelvis, his arm all the way up to his shoulder, and the side of his torso. The pain that erupted then was so intense that rather than make a loud scream, he gave a more muted, but still agonized caterwaul as a third of his body was suddenly ripped off the rest of it. Bits of flesh, bone and tendon drooping uselessly off his side as two limbs and a solid chunk of his torso was practically chewed off him. His ichor oozing and spouting out from the devastating wound as what remained of his ribcage, the organs within, and part of his pelvis that looked crushed were left visible as he floated in shock through the air. Not that this stopped him from being in the path of another falling rock of doom, and this time, for the moment, was in no shape to avoid it, given his healing factor had barely even kicked in yet. All he could do was look up in unmasked horror as the follow-up boulder shadowed over his body, poised to finish the job that its cohort had started, and squash the rest of him to bits deep beneath his mother gear's earthen body's crust. Damn it, Iapetus. Somewhat surprisingly to the cripplingly wounded Titan, his lord and younger brother came to his aid. The Titan lord taking the time, even while desperately dodging his own falling boulders, to make his way close to him, and with an aggravated battle cry, swinging up his scythe without a second's thought. The dark red aura of the curved blade meeting the rocky mass in its underbelly similar to how it had with the first boulder thrown after Pallas 1. Sparks flew from the collision as divine metal grinded against a monstrously aura-enhanced meteor for the briefest of moments in an intense struggle, before the primordial magic of the scythe won out. The aura-coated metal breaking through and cancelling out the divine power hugging unto the rock as it pierced through the earthy surface, cracking it all around like a feeble egg, before it shattered in the air. The boulder being reduced, just like its cousin, to but mere small chunks and pebbles dropping harmlessly over and around the two airborne titans. Snap back into focus, brother. I'm not about to let you fall to a bunch of damn rocks. Kronos roared out angrily and authoritatively, and even for Iapetus, It was hard to tell if that was out of genuine concern for him, or for the potential loss of his utility in battle later should he fall here. Though knowing his brother the way he did, it was likely more so the latter than the former. I'll need a moment. The older Titan managed to force out with enough effort, as his mangled body entered the process of healing, with the sensation of muscles, tendons, flesh and bone growing back hitting him immediately, and making him wish there was a way to make it go by faster. Then a moment you shall get, but don't make me regret it. Kronos replied hotly, grabbing a hold of his brother and pulling him along whilst deftly avoiding the falling boulders, doing his best to keep an eye on as many as possible while moving, so as to not get caught unawares. His eyes glowing red as a pulse of red aura was sent out from his flying form. The effect immediate on the clouds around him, as they quickly degraded and faded away into nothing. Almost as though someone had just pressed the fast forward button on a TV remote while watching this scene so they could speed things along. To Kronos' chagrin, however, this held no such effect on the boulders, which resisted the power of his divine domain he tried to enforce upon them. It'd probably work if he ascended, but he wasn't about to hedge his bets on that just yet, in case the Hecatonchias were waiting for that, and would simply put even more power into these things to resist while overwhelming him with quantity. All he could do for the moment was just dodge and dodge some more until he could think of something to counter this. Back on Crete. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Ha. Look at those bastards, scurrying around high in the sky like rodents. Gidges bellowed with hearty laughter that echoed throughout the isle, as he slung multiple boulders at a time far into the heavens, just like his brothers were still. Incredible to see all the confidence they had left crumble into dust before a few measly rocks being chucked at them, as though they were but helpless children. What a joke, ha ha. Easy there, brother. Don't count 'em out just yet. Briareus spoke up more seriously, though there was still a wide, bloodthirsty smile upon all of his faces. Until we see them flee, or be utterly crushed, don't assume 'em to be helpless, especially Kronos. Much as a little shit as he is, he's crafty and cunning. I would not be shocked if, given enough time, he was able to figure out a way around this. HNN. You don't need to remind me, Briareus. Gidges snorted bitterly, as he continued slinging dozens of rocks at a time. That fucker was the one who fooled us into treading into the underworld, before having us all tossed inside Tartarus below for ages past. I'm fully aware of what he's capable of. But as guileful as he is, I don't think even he'll be able to overcome this situation. Heck, I don't even think he's figured out the other reason why we haven't given him the treatment we gave that first Titan yet. Oh, I don't doubt that he will soon, if he hasn't already. Cottus beamed bloodthirstily, as he hurled some more boulders sky high alongside his brothers. Hey! Whether it's now, or when he tucks his tail between his legs and flees back to Othries, he'll notice eventually that the bulk of his army aren't coming back to him. Back near Olympus. As this constant hail of boulders was going on, Atlas, who'd yet to be in the pathway of any of them just yet, growled over the blade clenched between his teeth, as Themis tried to wrestle it away from him. All the while, Hestia and Demeter tried to break away from the painful chokehold he had them both in. Damn it all, we've lost all the momentum we came in with, and now my lord, uncles, and father are stuck trying to dodge those rocks being hurled at 'em from a distance, whilst the rest of our forces have been either routed entirely, or stuck not knowing what to do next. The muscle-bound Titan thought dismally, as he felt Thea's presence behind him much closer to the mountain, unmoving in her aloft position in the air. This siege will become a total failure, and perhaps even end in our resounding defeat unless I or Lord Kronos do something to change it. There was only one thing he could think of though, and that was to ascend. If he did that, he might be able to turn things around, even when up against the onslaught the Hecatonchires were firing in their direction, and all the enemy gods that would surely try to dogpile on him when he did. It was by no means a great solution, and his king would surely bark his head off for even thinking it without his go-ahead, but really, what choice did they have now? At this point, they really didn't stand a chance unless they went all in, and stopped being cautious. Pallas had been taken out because he'd been caught off guard and wasn't ready for what the 100-handed ones that his king and his father had told him about would retaliate with. He did though. He knew exactly what was coming now, thanks to Pallas' unintended sacrifice moments ago. He and the rest of them did now, in fact, and whilst it wouldn't be easy by any stretch, there was a chance that if they all ascended and kept as on guard as possible, they could weather the storm of both the Hecatonchires and the other gods' assault and turn this clusterfuck of an invasion around. Ugh. I can see that look in your eyes, Atlas. He heard Themis speak up with a grunt, drawing his attention more toward her, as she switched up her approach, thrusting herself in and snapping the sole of her foot directly into his temple. A move that before would have smacked his head all the way back and disoriented him enough to free her blade, and perhaps would have allowed for the younger goddess's escape from his grip. This time, however, now that his base was at its peak power, his head merely budged backwards at a small angle, with only a light amount of pain equivalent to a minor headache and potential bruise reaching his senses. Themis did not appear shocked by this, however. Or rather, she probably was hiding it incredibly well, as she continued. You're thinking of pushing yourself into your true divine form right now, aren't you? How astute of you, the bulky behemoth grunted back over her blade, feeling annoyance as the two goddesses he was keeping choked up tried elbowing him repeatedly in the chest and sternum, while flailing their legs about, trying to break free to no avail. Something that at his best would have been little issue on its own to deal with, were it not for the dark-haired, glowing-eyed one repeatedly sending out those pulses of golden aura over him, which had previously sapped him of nearly all will to fight. Of his strength. To what appeared to be the bitch's grim chagrin, however, now that Atlas had felt it twice, and could recall the telltale signs of it being in use, he was able to tense up and resist it. His willpower fending off its laxing effect on him with no small amount of effort, allowing him to maintain his true strength, though this didn't appear to stop her from continuously spamming him with it anyway. Probably because in her panic, she couldn't think of anything else to try on him, what with dematerialization and shape-shifting barred from use. She may not have been saying anything, but it was obvious she was in increasing distress to him. Damn it, let us go. Demeter croaked and growled over his bulky bicep, as one of her hands futilely grabbed and wrenched on his hair, pulling hard enough that were it not for his aura being at 100%, she would have no doubt ripped a huge clump of it out along with his scalp as she thrashed away in his chokehold. The other clenched into a dainty fist as she repeatedly drove her elbow full force into his abdomen alongside her sister to no avail. Their attacks barely winding him at this stage. Ack. I swear'll. Crack. Both other goddesses' eyes snapped over to Demeter briefly, as her body went limp, arms slumping down by her sides as she was held up within Atlas' arm. Though it was hard to see with the Titan's arm in the way, her face had turned a far nastier shade of purplish blue than her sister's was, with a wide-eyed expression that appeared unseeing whilst her head was now bent at an awkward angle, signifying her neck had just been broken. That, and a crushed windpipe, if the ichor drooling out her lips was anything to go by. That should shut her up for a bit. Atlas grunted over the sword still between his teeth with some bit of relief, knowing that so long as she was in his clutches like this, that fatal wound wouldn't be able to heal. She has courage, but is more annoying than anything else, the way she runs her mouth. And as for you, little fledgling, his other arm around Hestia's neck then clenched tighter, like a snake coiling in a death grip around its prey, getting a harsh wheeze out of the older sister's throat as it was steadily crushed as well. Her attempts to break free from his grasp becoming more desperate and frantic as the pressure increased. The front of a foot then flashed up before Atlas's eyes just before he could fully snap the other goddess' neck like a flimsy twig, smacking him hard in the face. The attack stunning him slightly, loosening his grip but a smidge as his head budged back, and a trickle of ichor pooled out from each of his nostrils. Hestia, now with a bit more breathing room as her hands held onto Atlas' bicep, followed her desperation kick up by releasing an incredibly strong pulse of golden aura that waved over him. One that carried the highest amount of her own divine will that she could force into it and attempted to make his will yield more than ever. The effect was immediate, and Atlas, having not expected her to increase the potency of her ability to that extent, felt his muscles relax to the extreme. More so than the first 2 times this power had been used on him, and amazingly, briefly overwhelmed his resistance, even if it was for but the briefest of instants. That was when Hestia struggled the hardest to break free of his grip as it slackened. Her eyes glowing brighter than they ever had before like golden rays of harmonious fire with her calming power in full effect, heavy strain showing on her features as she pushed herself outward with all her might. All whilst at the same time, Themis took advantage of this small opening. The Titaness grunting hard as she wrenched even harder on her sword, grating it along Atlas' teeth as she finally pulled it free with her shkriek. Ha! Once the divine metal was freed, Themis let out a terrifying war cry, as her hands and arms were already in motion, swinging with the momentum granted, as she got ready to slash back in the other direction and take Atlas' head off. Her divine aura having risen to the highest it could go in her regular form, as Hestia seemingly broke loose from the muscly titan, leaving him even more wide open for attack as her blade swung right back in for his neck. Her blade quite literally shimmering white as it arced in at mind-boggling speed. Aura! A sudden war cry resonated out from the hulking titan, his divine aura flashing outward as his muscles bulged, veins popping all over his body, even on his face, as his body whirred into motion as well. The arm holding the temporarily limp Demeter uncoiling whilst his shoving her forward violently, breaking Themis' swing as the younger goddess body unceremoniously barreled into her sternum and knocking the wind out of her. All the while, he stomped down on the external power weakening, and grabbed Hestia by the head with his other hand, holding her skull in a bone-crushing grip that saw his palm engulf her whole dome whilst his fingers down on her temple and the sides of her face. Hestia tried to kick backwards with her flailing feet and stun him at least, but this time, Atlas ate every shot she threw at him like it was nothing, his head barely tilting from each clap and smack of her bare feet striking his chin, cheeks, nose and forehead. The scene making it abundantly clear, if it wasn't so already, that she was by no means even a quarter as strong as her brother who'd embarrassed him back on O3's had been. She wasn't at it for long though. Before, whilst holding her like that, Atlas reared his arm back over and past his head, swinging Hestia's body up with it, her legs still flailing about desperately as he did so, upturned and now held at angle upside down. And then, as though she were little more than a human-shaped club, he brought her back down with all the force he could muster, slamming her body down back and ass first on her sister and Themis' heads with explosive force, just as the two seemingly recovered. A deafening bang ringing out akin to a sledgehammer impact on bones, outdone only by the sounds of the boulders dropping around them. Hestia's body contorted over the two other goddesses in real time, her spine cracking and splitting in twine, with various other bones and ligaments getting shattered from the collision and whiplash of the slam down, including her own neck, which snapped near instantaneously. Blood spewing forth from her yawning maw as a pained scream tried and failed to leave her throat. Her eyes beneath the Titan's hand widening and dimming as consciousness was briefly lost. All that whilst Themis and Demeter's heads were smashed down like watermelons. Blood, flesh and skull fragments breaking apart and launching out in various directions, as their now headless, ichor gushing bodies were sent careening down to the far depths below with a hellacious shockwave that was felt for countless miles. Themis' sword falling out of her hand and spinning down with her as the two female deities fell. It'll take more than your irksome ability to get the advantage on me now, little fledgling. Atlas bellowed, his attention temporarily focused solely on the goddess that had tried to best him again with the same damn trick, as he held her limp, broken body up before him as it, outside her neck thanks to his grip keeping it that way, started to heal. Your side may hold an advantage now, thanks to the 100-handed ones, but even they and their efforts will not hold Lord Kronos and the rest of our forces back forever. Is that what you think we're trying to do? Simply hold you back? The muscle-bound Titan's gaze shifted over to his side, recognizing the voice of his sibling, Prometheus, as he and Epimetheus flew down and stopped within 5 meters of him. Even now, your arrogance knows no bounds, brother. Keep this kind of hubris up, and you may end up just as bad as Menoetios. Before Atlas could respond to that, his senses kicked into high gear and had his body twirling around while pushing back some meters himself, the glinting steel blades of a trident stabbing down right where he'd just been and almost piercing through his skull. The figure of Poseidon right with it, glaring daggers at him as Atlas narrowed his eyes right back. A mocking retort already on the tip of his tongue for the failed sneak attack. Ack. The Titan never got the chance to though, as he suddenly felt the sensation of 2 hands over his arm, despite nobody being near him, before something smashed up into the arm that held the limp body of Hestia at the elbow. The blow earning a sound of pain from him, and while not enough to break any of the bones thanks to his densely packed aura protecting him, it was enough to send tremors through his limb, and get his hand to involuntarily let go of the goddess' head. All before whatever invisible force had just attacked him grabbed the, for the moment, unmoving body of the goddess in a bridal carry, given her position, and hauled ass away from him to be beside the god wielding the trident. Treating our sisters like an absolute brute, will you? Poseidon spoke gruffly with a look of malice etched on his face, and a piercing glare with his deep green eyes as he readied his trident by his side for a forward thrust. Somewhat channeling his elder brother's energy from back with Hyperion, as he said rather nonchalantly, but also menacingly. Well, we can't have that. Meanwhile, closer to the mountain, Thea grit her teeth as she watched this. The Titaness' attention having been mostly on Kronos and her 3 other brothers frantically dodging as many of the Hecatonchia's boulders as they could, up till this moment. Her eyes now zoned in mostly on Atlas and those surrounding him, and feeling the compulsion to go and come to his aid. But what if that's what these bastards want me to do, so they can take us both out as quick as possible? She thought immediately with caution, having not failed to notice that she and Atlas had yet to have a boulder hurled close enough to them that either had to evade it. Not that this stopped her from flicking her eyes up every now and then to check anyway, given she didn't believe for a second that being where she was made them think twice about it. Otherwise, Pallas wouldn't have gotten bashed out of the sky like he had despite his close proximity with the mountain earlier. So then why were they being spared for the moment? Was it for a reason she just couldn't see, or were they just messing with them? Because she'd be an utter fool to think she was safe. Beginning to panic yet. Styx's mocking, spiteful voice chuckled from behind her, causing Thea to whip around with a closed-fisted backhand that missed its mark, as the Oceanid pulled back, letting it sail harmlessly by her features. Wounds now fully healed, though her tunic was flapping in the wind behind and by her hips, clinging onto her front at this point through a liberal use of magic. Because I don't know about you, Thea, but were I in your position right now, I wouldn't regard my chances at succeeding as being good. Funny. I don't recall asking for your opinion. Thea growled back. Hands balled into fists. Her divine aura flaring as she glared balefully at the second-generation Titaness. And don't get cocky. Even with the Hecatonchias backing you up, we will find a way to counter, and once we do, You'll what? Take us down and then get your precious brother husband back from gear. Styx snorted derisively, cutting the other goddess off and earning a murderous scowl. Honestly, Thea, you're beyond pathetic. Have you really not noticed it yet? Noticed what? Thea bit back scathingly, though admittedly somewhat unnerved. How could she not be with the threat of being sniped out of the air at any moment by a magically enhanced boulder, and everything else going on with her allies because of the Hecatonchias? She was not about to show that kind of fear to Styx though, and give her second most hated person even more ammunition than she already had. So, instead of properly engaging with her crap, she decided instead to throw out her own insult right back. All I notice right now is your horrible state of dress after getting run through by Pallas. Reminds me of those whorish nymphs that can't keep a tunic on right for 5 minutes before hopping on someone else's dick. She managed to quirk a mocking grin of her own, despite the anxiousness creeping under the surface. Then again, you're one of them, so that hardly comes as a shock. HMPH. Cute. Styx almost rolled her eyes, seemingly unfazed by her fellow Titaness comeback. I've heard worse from your brother husband quite recently, and last I checked, him running his mouth didn't help him any against us. Styx took a wee bit more pleasure than necessary at seeing Thea's put-on grin flop and turn into a scowl once more. And it won't help you either. But, seeing as you don't have the intelligence needed to figure this out on your own, I'll just pose a question for you. Did you honestly believe that if you broke the barrier and, as of now, somehow find a way around the Hecatonchias' attacks, that you can turn this back around? Styx's amused, mocking smile only grew larger as she saw the narrowing of the first-generation Titaness eyes. The older of the two somehow managing to sound offended. What? You think we can't? You've done nothing other than fall for every trap that Metis has set so far, so I'm feeling pretty confident when I say, yes, I don't believe you can. Styx rebuked with confident condescension, further angering, and worrying, her foe. It's been genuinely entertaining, I must say though, watching all of you flounder about desperately like this in the hopes that you can turn this back into your favor, as if you ever had it to begin with. Entertaining. Thea shook with rage, doing her best to temper it into a cold fury after hearing something so dismissive of the threat they should be posing to them. The knuckles of her fists turning white as she balled and clenched them deep into her palms, almost drawing blood with her nails. You find all of this entertaining? I just saw my irksome former consort get flattened into paste right before my eyes, and I get to watch you and yours squirm pathetically in the position we've put you in, until we either send you scurrying back to O3s, or flatten you too. Styx, smile could not have looked more pleasured, sickly pleasured, by her own words, as she spoke them. Tell me, Thea, why wouldn't I be entertained watching those I hate get what's coming to them? Thea bristled as she felt Styx's condescension hit new heights, watching as the goddess planted her hands on her curvy hips and took a brief glance down at Atlas, scoffing at the position he'd gotten himself into. Oh, and by the way, if you start to think ascending might help you here, then you're perhaps even more stupid than I'd previously thought. Her gaze then shot back to her with a sneer. We'll have you blasted right out of the heavens as soon as you try. The crackle of thunder nearby, even over the sounds of dive-bombing boulders, caught Thea's attention then, as did it with Atlas, as both felt a frighteningly strong surge of divine power by the edge of Olympus' peak above them. Then, while keeping their senses locked on the other assembled gods and the area around them so as to be more prepared for any sudden movements of flung boulders, both deities glanced up to where that power originated from. I think that I've seen more than enough nonsense out of you this day, Atlas. Zeus remarked coldly, blue lightning shimmering and crackling all over his form and out of his glowing, sky-blue eyes, as his thunderbolt crafted by the Cyclopes was raised above his head, right before both titans. His incredible ire fully leveled on the aforementioned, without so much as a peek in Thea's direction. To think that you can get away with treating my sisters like you have, as well as our most esteemed ally Themis, in my and my brother's presence, is truly the height of arrogance. Arrogance that I shall smite you for here and now. TCH. Looks like I'll have to ascend sooner than I thought. Atlas, despite the power he was feeling from that weapon and Zeus at the moment, remained stony and defiant, as he clenched his raised fists by his sides. A decision finally made. Bring it on, fledgling. Whatever you throw at me, I shall endure. He bellowed, as his power began to spike upwards in a way that all the Olympians were well acquainted with now, his form beginning to glow. Ha! A feminine battle cry full of determination echoed out over the sound of thunder and earth-battering meteors, as a familiar golden aura exploded outward in that instant, slamming into Atlas almost like a pressurized projectile that covered his entire body. His eyes widening as the glow of his body ever so briefly dissipated, with his willpower immediately kicking in to push away the external power working him over. For most, such a moment in time would have been insignificant, and not something that could have been capitalized on by the time Atlas would fully recover. For Zeus and Poseidon, however, who were already charged and ready for attack, that small instant abort was all either of them needed. Endure this then, you thick-headed brute. Poseidon roared, sea-green aura flaring immensely around him and his weapon, water swirling violently like a raging typhoon around each of the sharp blades of his trident, as he thrusted forward full force. The swirling blades of cerulean blue aqua coated in the young god's divine aura launching forth in a tri-pronged projectile that struck into Atlas' midsection, piercing into his hardy flesh like razor-sharp lances of watery devastation that they were. 3 bloody sprays followed, bursting out around his gut as the attacks go red through him with little resistance. Shock showed in the Titan's eyes at how easily they did, as a gasping cough shot from his open maw, ichor flying out mixed with spittle as 3 garish holes were punctured through rendered flesh all the way out past his back, with 3 small geysers of ichor following the dissipating, watery projectiles. What the? How did that? He wasn't given the time to finish that frazzled thought, as Zeus followed up his brother's attack immediately by launching his own fully charged thunderbolt directly down on the stunned Titan. The divine electricity given shape becoming so large that when it finally struck the vulnerable Atlas, the flash created seemingly lit up the entire sky a shade of static blue, as a truly titanic shockwave of force was released upon impact. the excess force buffeting everything and everyone in a radius of uncountable kilometers, as apocalyptically gale force winds briefly spread out throughout the skies. All this, as whatever scream of agony Atlas could have let out, if he had let out any, was drowned out by the deafeningly loud strike of thunder and cataclysmically explosive crackling of lightning at the epicenter. The vast majority of which, in terms of the power released, he took the brunt of, as he was given an absolutely cosmic tear electrocution. The divine lightning like nothing his base state had ever had to take before, as to those still able to watch, who didn't have to shield their eyes from the wind or brightness of the blast, caught split-second flashes of what looked like the Titan's skeleton in the statically azure light. Atlas! Thea cried out in horror and shock, as she fully turned and took her attention off Styx. Total disbelief painting over her features at the raw, and frankly, terrifying power put on display. The sheer magnitude of which outdoing anything any god not in their ascended state should have been capable of by leaps and bounds. The other Titans, despite still dodging the falling boulders as best they couldn't help but thrust the gazes toward Olympus as they not only heard and felt the explosive shockwave and winds from the attack, but also their sister's terror-struck exclamation. None of which could believe their eyes either, as where Atlas once floated now, even if just temporarily, was but only a golden mist that spread away in the wind with even faster expedience than that of ashes, as they blew out quickly towards Kronos and company. Impossible, he managed to reduce Atlas to a bloody mist. The Titan Lord thought, stunned speechless by the ferocious power Zeus's weapon displayed. And yes, he recognized it as a weapon, one clearly forged by a master craftsman using the same materials as what his scythe had been, for nothing else would be capable of holding in and producing that level of deific power. No. Iapetus, now fully healed and despite the heavy risk, rushed over to where his son's mist trailed, only to get beaten to the punch by a hurled boulder that slammed right into it. His hand left outstretched as his son's bloody mist dispelled outwards and clung almost like a gaseous veil with several wisps rising over the rock from the point of impact, as it shot away in an arc not too dissimilar to the way Pallas had. And as it did, the hurtling rock and bloody mist of Atlas soon plummeted not into the ground, but into the infinite ocean far, far away from even the base of Olympus by innumerable miles, well passing out the distance of the younger Titan's perforation below. The final blow effectively stopping the muscle-bound Titan from regenerating himself in any timely fashion, and removing him from the battlefield completely, as a geyser of uprooted water could be witnessed in the distance from where the boulder struck and sunk. The stupidly tall pillar of displaced water shooting high up into the heavens, far enough that had any of the gods been floating over it at the current height, they would have been splashed and swept up by its ascent. Fuck. Kronos screeched, not only from witnessing his general get taken out of the battle, but also from the several boulders that almost struck him, as he was forced to keep moving, as were his brothers. The youngest spotting the angered and distraught look on Iapetus's face, from not even being able to check on his son at all or help reconstitute himself from the mist he was reduced to, as the falling boulders kept him from trying to go to him. Meanwhile, back near the mountain, the forms of Demeter and Themis flew back up, now totally healed themselves. The latter somewhat miffed, but overall pleased to see Atlas dealt with for the time being, whereas the former looked almost ready to blow a fuse after getting taken out the way she had, and not being able to pay the Titan back for it. Both were greeted kindly all the same by the others, included the additional nymphs and so forth that had avoided getting hit by the Olympian's trap for the Titans. Poseidon turned toward Prometheus then with a raised eyebrow as this was going on, catching the older Titan's attention, as the immediate threat of Atlas was dealt with. A question plaguing his mind from the deity's earlier comment. Who the heck is Menoetios? He asked befuddled, getting a humored chuckle from the future-seeing god and his hindsight brother. A brother of ours, the same as Atlas. Trust me, if you ever end up meeting him on the battlefield, you'll understand exactly why I said what I said, and why I'm not shocked he isn't present here. He replied back, sounding far more amused now than anything else, which only made Poseidon even more curious than before, as he nodded and left it there for the time being. Around the same time, Hades reappeared with his helm still donned and lightly smiled down at Hestia, as she seemed to be fully recovered. You doing fine there, Hestia? He couldn't help but ask, getting a small chuckle from his elder sibling, along with a warm, loving smile as she hugged him while still in the bridal carry. More than fine, thanks to you and our brothers, Hades. She replied back kindly and affectionately, as Hades let her go, allowing her to float by his side as she righted herself to a more upright position before parting from the embrace. I don't think I've ever taken that much damage before, I must say. Even in my spar with Beerus, I don't recall suffering that kind of punishment. And had you not freed me from his grasp, I fear that while in my catatonic state, he would have continued to brutalize my body with repeated use like his own personal bludgeoning tool. Good thing that didn't come to pass. Hades grimaced at the thought, but then grinned all the same in a borderline dark visage. He's lucky Beerus isn't here with us right now though, for if he was, he'd be more furious than any of us, I'm sure. And after what he did to Hyperion, I doubt there'd be any chance Atlas could ever make a comeback after he was done with him. Hestia merely shook her head in slight amusement, knowing that what her younger brother said was more than likely true, whilst Hades let out a small bit of a laugh at the thought. The latter wishing his elder brother actually was here with them now, just so he'd get to see that, and see Atlas get punished even more severely for his hubris. See? Just like I told you. Blasted right out of the heavens. Styx, words were cool, yet filled with a level of vindictive smugness as she openly gloated to Thea's back with what some might construe as a haughty smirk. Oh, but don't let that stop you. If you want to have a go yourself and try to shift things in your side's favor by going into your true divine form, have at it. I could do with the amusement of watching you get brutally crushed by one of the Hecatonchires boulders for your trouble. Thea's teeth ground together. Rage from all the mocking and fear from the hundred-handed ones, as well as Zeus's with his frightening power to a lesser extent both melding together inside her in a horrid combination. The negative feelings stewing within her like a festering sickness that blighted her nerves, and as a consequence, made her more vexed than she'd ever been in her immortal life. Not even the era where her father had reigned over the universe with an iron fist and lorded over her and her siblings, had she felt this awful. You know, I doubt we'll be seeing Atlas again for the rest of this battle after that. And with him gone, my oafish ex-consort dealt with, the rest of your forces routed, and your brothers busy dodging the Hecatonchires boulders, trying not to get squashed, all that leaves, is you Thea. Styx said, laying it on the Titaness' shoulders as thick as possible. The Oceanid inwardly overjoyed at how much of a roaring success her little sister's tactics and plan had been, to the point they'd flipped the entire siege on its head, and put the Titans on the defensive, with no path in sight for them to alter it. If Kronos or any of his brothers tried ascending now, no matter how little time it took to do so, that tiny window, as both they and everyone else knew, would be enough for the Hecatonchires to smack them out of the sky before, or just as they did so with full force. So, either way, they got taken out now if they tried that. They might have had a better chance if they'd showed up ascended to begin with, but that would be under the assumption that they knew what the Hecatonchias would be doing beforehand, which they wouldn't have. So, either way, going in blind like they had to, and regardless of if they'd chosen to go all in from the beginning rather than play it cautious first, they were bound to have been stopped by them and the hundred-handed giants no matter what. So now, the only one left from their side who was free to attempt anything to change the course of the battle, was the elder Titaness in front of her, who looked increasingly more uncomfortable by the second at her situation. Add that in with the clearly overflowing emotions that she could sense pouring off of her, and Styx decided she couldn't resist the temptation anymore, as she charged forward. Thea's eyes widened further, only snapping back to reality completely when the younger, second-generation Titaness had flown too close for comfort, and attempted to lash out with a spinning back elbow to ward her off. This, however, was a mistake, as Styx easily ducked underneath it, letting her arm harmlessly swing overhead as she reared an open hand back, before popping up and lashing it forward with a heavy-sounding smack, as she slapped the older Titaness across the face. Thea's cheek contorted, lips pursing and yawning as they almost flew to the other side of her face from the smack. Her head clapped sideways and nearly twisting the whole way round her shoulder, as the spit mixed with a bit of ichor shot out from her maw and flew out down the side, before Styx sent her head spinning the other way around with another heavy-sounding smack, as she came right back in with a backhand that cracked her, sending more spittle and ichor flying from her gob in the process. Come now, Thea. You're the last hope your brothers have left to turn this failure of a siege around. Surely, you can do better than that. Styx goaded further, pushing the Titaness buttons and getting a growl from her, as she swung for her wildly with a punch, with Oceanid easily pulled her head back from, allowing it to whiz by harmlessly, before she struck back with a front kick to her solar plexus. The blow bending her over her foot and knocking the air and some droplets of blood out of her with a harsh wheeze. Ack. You bitch. Anger taking hold, Thea once again swung in wildly with a flurry of strikes in retaliation, throwing super fast punches, elbows and kicks at the infuriating Oceanid. All of which were either parried by Styx, own limbs that flew out to meet them, or evaded with bobs of her head, or by torquing her body with what seemed like practiced ease. The older Titaness, in her emotional state, not quite recognizing just how much more telegraphed her attacks were compared to before. Shut oof. The Titaness was cut off by a vicious elbow driven into her gut that had her hunched over Styx, arm wheezing out blood, before the Oceanid twisted her body and slammed her other elbow straight into Thea's exposed face. The blow shattering some teeth and crunched her nose inward as it snapped her head back with light spurts of ichor from bashed nasal passages and torn gums. Her tunic was then grabbed by Styx, hand by the window, exposing some of her pale C-cup cleavage while she was disoriented, the silk tunic crumpling in her grip as her fingers gnawed into the fabric, keeping the Titaness from falling back any further momentarily. By the way, what you said before about my horrible state of dress, I don't know why you think you're one to talk. Another kick from the sole of Styx, foot smashed into Thea's abdomen, driving her back as Styx, hand suddenly wrenched forward, drawing out a ripping sound below the cacophony of noise ahead of them with the falling boulders, as the elder Titaness tunic was torn apart. The entire upper section around her front being prized clear off into tatters of silk thrown back to the wind. The act exposing the entire front of her torso to the elements, showing off plenty more of her sublime skin and allowing the stunned Titaness shapely, pale globes to bounce out freely in the open, heavenly air which kissed her stiff, pinkish nipples and cascaded over her fleshy mounds. Woo. Taken aback by this, Thea was left open for an uppercut that cracked into her jaw, and at the very least dislocated it, as her head was flung up in a daze. All the while, the lower half of her blood-soiled, knee-length tunic, alongside the remains of the upper portion over her back, fluttered off her person, having been held up by nothing at that point, and was pulled down and away by the flowing winds. Good heavens! What a show! Zeus thought from up above as he turned his gaze briefly to the two female deities' skirmish. Him being the only one to do so, as everyone else trusted in Styx to be able to handle the Titaness, and thus kept their attention focused on Kronos and co., in case they tried anything in the dire situation. And thank his lucky stars he was, as he definitely didn't want to have to explain to his consort beside him why he was currently ogling their nude enemy with lust because of how almost irresistibly gorgeous she was exposed like this. Nor how erect he'd quickly gotten beneath his tunic because of her bared appearance. You insinuate that I'm whorish for my poor state of dress, and yet here you are now, naked as the day you were born from Gaia. The Oceanid exclaimed aloud with more aggression than was necessary, fully aware of how utterly petty exposing her like this for her earlier insult was, but damn proud of it regardless, for being yet another notch on putting the bitch in her place. Her senses telling her that Zeus's gaze was on him now, which she assumed was for her sake to smite Thea in case she got the better of her somehow. She had no idea how wrong she was on that idea, but the truth hardly mattered in this instance anyway. Not when she could feel the approaching presences of four gods that she knew all too well, which got a more genuine smile from her inwardly. Ha, how dare you! Thea screeched in fury, after fully taking in her current state, courtesy of Styx, in slack-jawed embarrassment. The humiliated Titaness lashing forward, and despite the fear, felt an overwhelming need to tear the Oceanid's head off for all that she'd done. The latest act simply pushing her past her breaking point as she thrusted forward in blind rage. Not even bothering to try and cover up, given how pointless it would be, as she swung in with her fist. Too irrational at this point to even think of ascending, or pay attention to anything else around her. This mindset cost her greatly, as both her arms and legs were suddenly seized in vice-like grips, halting her in her tracks. Her breasts bouncing from the jolting stop, as she snarled and swiveled her head around to see what, or in this case, whom, had stopped her. Easy there, you tightly wound wench. No need to be so feisty now. Bea crooned mockingly, as she held one of her arms back with one hand and gave her a cheeky grin. Her sister and brothers each keeping one of her other limbs on lockdown as she thrashed about in the grip, desperate to pull away. Don't you know that letting your emotions control you like that on the battlefield is a bad idea? Smack. Thea's body flinched, with her letting out a gasp and her boobs bobbing on her chest from shock, as she felt an unwanted, feminine hand spank her hard enough on the ass to leave a red imprint. Her firm, but perky cheeks left wobbling from the force of the strike, as Bea's grin grew just a little wider. That goes doubly so for you, given that you're in the nude. Might end up giving some of us the wrong idea when you come rushing in like that. She said with a whistle, laying in another hard smack to her plump rump for good measure, and also just to mess with her more, since she could already tell how much it drove her up the wall, from what she'd peeped of her mother's actions against her. Do you really have to do that, sister? Nike merely sighed at her crass behavior, as she held the Titaness' other arm, but otherwise made no attempt to stop her, whilst Kratos and Zealous, who held her curvy legs, simply snorted at their sister's antics, finding them both amusing and admittedly somewhat arousing. Ah, come on, sister. She was wide open for it. Bea grinned over at her. You can't expect me to just let this scandalous Titaness off after she tried charging mother while nude. And besides, I need a way to blow a bit of steam off before we pull our worthless father out from the hole the Hecatonchias put him in. She then turned her gaze back to the struggling Thea, whose expression was beyond mortified and murderous at the same time. You don't mind, do you, Thea? Rah. Let me go. She raged, pushing with all her strength to free herself from the four gods holding her, only for her limbs to barely even budge, as they all held her down tight. Something that only made her emotionally driven being lash out even harder to escape, her body squirming and struggling to break away from the four deities' hold, something which only succeeded in getting her ample tits to sway and jostle, whilst her hips shook from side to side. Almost as if she were putting some kind of clumsy, erotic dance, as she shivered from the bastard wind creeping and gliding over her sex as she rustled around furiously. Why, you'll all pay dearly for this, I swear. Despite her threat, her struggles were a fruitless effort, unless she ascended like Pallas had done to break away from the abhorrent spawn of the Oceanid. A move that would all but guarantee her getting starched by the Hecatonchias, and the four children of Styx, including the goddess herself, and even Thea herself deep down, knew this. Which was why none of the opposing deities against the Titaness showed even a wink of concern for the potential of her doing so. You dare to threaten my children now, even in your pitiful position. Of course, this didn't stop Styx from taking offense to the threat over her children, as hollow as it may have been, as she floated forward. Now but only a foot away from the struggling Titaness, who snarled into her face in contempt. Pearly white teeth gnashing together as she kept trying to force herself forward, in the hopes that she could at the very least rake the insufferable goddess eyes out and hear her own anguished screams one more time, after all the shit she'd put her through. I'll do more than threaten 'em, you conceited Oceanid. Sharp nails finding the forearm of Nike's hand holding her, she pumped some divine power into them and scraped them along her flesh as deep as she could in one grueling motion. The act tearing apart skin and spilling ichor out from the cuts, as the younger goddess hissed in pain, her grip slackening enough for Thea to briefly pull that arm free, and then swipe down savagely with those same nails for the Oceanid herself. Styx pulled back enough to where they missed her head and face, but wasn't fast enough to stop the swiping hand from landing on the magically clinging remains of her own tunic, which never stood a chance. The flimsy fabric being torn from her body instantly and sent scattering away in tatters to the wind from her form, exposing the rest of her own superbly shaped, hourglass figure to the naked air. Her sizable D-cup mounds of creamy, feminine fat left to jiggle and sway out in the open for all to see above her taut belly with her own stiffened, peachy pink nipples to be kissed by the elements, alongside her petaled lips between her legs. A sight that had a certain silver-haired god who was still watching 'em inwardly cheering, no matter how improper it may have been. Ugh. You bloody bitch. Nike cursed with an angered expression over the stinging pain in her healing arm, as she latched onto her free arm and pulled it back again, this time with both of her hands. One by the wrist, and the other by the elbow, so as to stop a repeat from happening. Her brother Kratos delivering a clubbing blow with his free fist to the Titaness gut in retaliation, knocking the wind and some droplets of blood out of her mouth in a sharp exhale, as Styx snarled this time and grabbed her by the chin. The hand holding her head in place as the Oceanid glared deep into her eyes, and was met right back with the Titaness' own death stare in return. You're really not the brightest one, are you, Thea? Lips peeled back into a toothy scowl. The look in Styx' eyes then could have wilted most gods' courage in an instant, as her body glowed a radiant and menacing grayish white. A sudden spike in power making it clear she was one small step away from ascending herself then and there. Having no other way to get physical with her, and inwardly knowing she didn't have much of a way out of this anyway, Thea chose to be spiteful right back toward one of her two most hated adversaries once again. Her throat audibly hawking up, before she spat directly into Styx's eye, making the latter cringe as the slimy substance splattered into her and forced her head to turn away, before she wiped the fluid off of her face with her free arm. Expression twice as murderous as it was before, and with a gaze so cold it could have frozen even the brightest of stars in place. Kratos. Celis. Nike. Beer. Fan out and make sure you've got each of her limbs held nice and tight for me. The goddess four children obliged that request instantly, tightening their hold as much as possible on the titaness as each moved back. Thea's continued struggles getting her nowhere as her arms were stretched out by her sides and legs were spread wide apart, leaving her as open as possible as her chest heaved in and out. Exposed breasts rising up and down with her heated breaths as the spawn of Styx felt the palpability of their mother's fury in her tone and cadence. For a second, it appeared as though Styx would use this opportunity to wail on her fellow titaness to her heart's content, but instead, she let go of her chin and pulled herself back a good distance away from them. Her body coming to float a good 30 meters from them, with her glare never leaving Thea as she did. You're just like your brother husband, Thea. Someone that desperately needs to be put into their place for how they act. She bellowed out loud enough for said titaness and her progeny to hear. And you know what? I'd be more than happy to be the one to do it. With that exclamation done, Styx let out one last war cry as she then charged forth at full speed, her form blurring from the insane velocity she was able to give herself, as she closed the distance within a fraction of a picosecond. Body turning horizontal as she came close, pulling her knees up to her chest and squishing her naked knockers down, bulging their supple flesh out around them before making them pop back out as she thrusted her feet forward with all the power she could muster. Pah! Thea's pupils shrunk to the size of pinpricks in sheer agony, air and ichor in equal measure knocked out of her open, gasping more as Styx's feet struck her with terrific force in the abdomen. Her torso contorting and bending in over the soles and toes of the Oceanide's bare feet, as the power of the dropkick to her unprotected midsection all but smashed her ribcage to pieces, and ruptured just about every organ housed within as she hit like a high-speed battering ram. The sound of flesh and bone being torn reached their ears next, and it was like music to Styx's in this instance, as the force of her dropkick literally ripped the rest of Thea's body away from her trapped limbs. A tremendous shockwave blasting out and buffeting the Oceanide's four children, as Thea's torso and head were sent sailing back at breakneck speed, being little more than a bodily blur with a high-pitched crack sound echoing out. All as her torn arms and legs, still in her children's grips, spurted out gushes of golden blood from their stumps as bones once connected to others jutted out. Kronos, who'd heard the tail end of the confrontation, saw the disfigured, blood-spewing titaness zooming towards him like a shooting star and clucked his tongue. His free hand outstretching to catch the female deity as she shot in close, breaking her momentum with a grunt of exertion, as he used a good deal of his strength to halt her. The action earning another sharp gasp of pain from her as she came to a stop with the nape of her neck held in his grip, with what remained of her body for the moment flopping down in front of him. Her ichor spurting and spilling forth from the stumps left behind where her limbs had been, as she hacked and coughed up blood violently. With his senses stretched out, the Titan Lord realized in that moment, as did his brothers, that the pelting of boulders had actually stopped, even if just momentarily, and a brief glance up revealed that no new ones were forthcoming just yet, which was a relief. He didn't even consider the notion that it was because those ugly, hundred-handed bastards had run out of ammo though, seeing as they could easily fashion more in no time, and slap them right out of the heavens, if they wanted to. Unbeknownst to him, Metis had given a hand signal toward the isle-bound giants to halt their attack for the moment, which they had gladly obliged to. Had enough of a beating yet, Kronos? Metis' voice resonated out through the heavens almost telepathically, as she met Kronos' glare from across the distance between them. Her expression stony and focused on him, his brothers, and his regenerating sister, in case they tried anything else. Or would you prefer to get pelted some more by the Hecatonchias, only this time, to have them really try to hit you? She asked pointedly, narrowing her eyes down at him as he narrowed his back. One use of his sensing ability downward revealed why she'd said that, even though he'd already figured it out by this point, despite most of his attention being focused on avoiding the boulders. He could feel the presences of his once large army of gods he'd brought with him squashed and buried deep beneath the earth, unable to regenerate given how badly crushed they were underground. Outside of the immediate threats of Pallas and Atlas to a lesser degree, the Hecatonchias' aiming choice that gave him and his brothers enough time to react, were by design, not really meant for them, even if it had looked like it. They'd been meant for his army up to now, while under the guise of going after him and his brothers, to ensure they were distracted as much as possible, and wouldn't have enough breathing room to safely go into their ascended states and set up any potential defense. Kronos grit his teeth angrily at the thought, as he recognized that they'd been played expertly by their opponents, and had their forces dwindled to the extreme. Brother. He heard Thea cough during her recovery, as he felt the gaze of his sister turn on him. He did not turn to look down at her though, even as he felt added weight from her limbs growing back. Rather, he kept his eyes locked on Metis, and to an equal extent, his youngest son Zeus, whose attention had shifted over to him, and like with the rest of their forces, looked ready to fight on if necessary. What will we do now? Kronos remained silent. His gaze flitting by Metis and Zeus, and peering forth to the untouched palace that sat behind them, as now that he was freer to use his sensing ability for things outside of the boulders, he could feel out for his eldest son. His number one target to get rid of, so as to ensure his reign would continue. The Titan King wanting to see where he'd been all this time, and if this moment wasn't just a setup for him to make his grand entrance to battle and take him out himself. His brothers and sisters watched him, as he did. Iapetus more tentatively than the others, given his gaze constantly flew out to where his son's mist had been shot to, looking uncertain as to if he should try and go to his son now, or wait a little more, given the threat the Hecatonchias still posed in his mind. None were able to see into his mind as they waited for him to respond. All they did see was the tightening of his hand around the shaft of his scythe, and the sudden glow of red that peered through his eyes, as his body seemed to twitch with barely contained fury. His blood-red aura rising like an inferno over his form, as his power spiked, and for a moment, it looked like he'd throw caution to the wind and ascend into his true divine form to continue the battle. Everyone tensed. His allies for what this would bring on top of them, the opposing gods in case he didn't back down and came at them again, with Metis in particular remaining calm and fierce, as she raised a hand above her head in response. Be wise, Kronos. Whatever you think you might be able to pull off on us quickly, I assure you, the Hecatonchias can and will stop it and you on my command. She bellowed out confidently and authoritatively. Inwardly though, she was hoping he didn't go for ascension now, as even with the Hecatonchias' speed, there was always the chance that he may have figured something out, and would just need to go into his true divine form to accomplish it. The Titan Lord's eyes glowed even brighter, almost as if he hadn't listened to a word of what she'd said, as he raised his scythe up above his head. All the while, he pushed his now fully healed up sister to the side and away, as even his body started to glow faintly below his aura. "Oh, you little bitch. I dare you to try and make a play," Briareus remarked darkly back on Crete, as he and his brothers were tensed as well and ready to go, as they watched on in anticipation. All of them clenching dozens of recently made boulders in their hands, with the piles from before depleted. Their own auras spiking up to the point that not even their mother's magic veil could properly hide their monstrous, cosmos-quaking power, as the eyes on all of their faces began to glow a cloudy gray. Kronos was quick to pick up on this as soon as their power started leaking, as did everyone else there. His siblings stiffening under the intensity of the power they could feel radiating from down below. And though they all kept a strong face, not a one of them didn't feel their nervousness shoot up as it became clear that they're not so well hidden anymore. Giant siblings were primed and ready to go in even harder than they had previously. Which, considering what they'd already done, that was terrifying no matter what way you spun it. Even still, it didn't look like Kronos was deterred, as his scythe glowed the deepest, darkest shade of crimson yet, while space and time began to crackle and warp around him. His power only ascending higher seemingly, and putting quite literally everyone on edge, as it looked like he'd be just crazy enough to actually go for broke even in this situation. Only for him to swing his scythe down opposite their direction with a swish. The blade cutting through not just the air, but space itself, as its crimson light radiated out with the sound of shattered glass following, as the spell that had been cast earlier by both parties, putting up a dual barrier to stop any teleportation and such from either side, was broken. Thusly freeing everyone to use the divine abilities that they'd nullified until now. Kronos made no move to take advantage of this to try and get a leg up though, for he knew they could still get in his way with the same said abilities, and could also erect a new one whenever they wanted to trip him up for the waiting Hecatonchias. Instead, he gave a brutal glare over at all of the assembled gods against him, as his eyes never stopped shining the bloodiest of reds. "Don't think this is over, you little whelps. You may've managed to rout the majority of my army, but they were little more than added backup. What you've accomplished today is little more than a setback for me and my kin. Little more than a setback. Is he actually fucking serious?" Hades couldn't help but think to himself in disbelief, unable to stop himself from wondering if his atrocious father was genuine there, if he hadn't gone senile with a claim like that. And he wasn't the only one on their side having such a thought either. Metis was not one of them though. Nor was Themis or Styx, or the brothers Prometheus and Epimetheus. They all took such a claim deathly seriously, despite everything that had just happened. "Enjoy your little victory here for now, for it will not last," he said coldly, as his form began to show flickers of gold, which appeared to be a signal for the remaining titans, as their forms too started faintly glowing gold as well. Kronos' blood-red sclera then bored into Metis with nothing but contempt. "Oh, and if that irksome son of mine should manage to pick himself up from the slumber he's in right now, be sure to let him know that we'll back soon enough, and that sooner or later, I'll be taking his head." And with those final parting words, Kronos vanished in a slew of golden particles. His Titan siblings not far behind as their forms also disappeared, with Koios, Krios and Thea all glaring at certain gods as they did, whilst Iapetus gave one final glance toward his sons with disappointment, before turning his gaze toward where his other son had been launched, as he disappeared. The cut Kronos had made in space fizzling away with the departure. And once they were all gone, especially Kronos, only then did Metis finally sag and let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding, as everyone else seemed to sag with relief as well to varying extents, knowing that the battle was over. For now. I think I'll take you up on that offer now, Zeus. Metis said as she turned to her consort, leaning herself and her chest into his muscly arm, pancaking her clothed mounds against it as she let out a tense sigh. All whilst the Cyclopes chose that moment to flood their magic out and re-erect the previously broken barrier of Olympus back up to full strength, giving them some layer of security again, even if it meant precious little to Kronos whenever he decided to come back. I could really do with having this tension taken away by your services right now. Zeus chuckled a little awkwardly and tensely at this. His erection from the earlier show he'd gotten from Styx and Thea still hard as ever beneath his tunic, as he felt a perverse desire to bed either of them, which he promptly quashed as best he could, as he gazed down at his consort. The lustful feelings he'd gained from her sister and their Titaness enemy now being focused exclusively on her, as he circled an arm around her shoulders. I could say the same to you, Metis, he finally replied tersely. Eyes unfortunately catching sight of the naked Styx again, the fine piece of ass that she was, as she flew by with her children, no doubt towards where Pallas had been sent to collect him. All before then seeing the other exceedingly beautiful goddesses and nymphs return to the mountain's peak with them, including Themis and his sisters especially, before he finally tore his eyes back to Metis, and cursed himself inwardly for his perverse weakness. Yet also thanking the stars simultaneously that Metis hadn't noticed him leering at other female deities. Zeus quickly turned around with Metis in tow, beads of divine sweat trickling from his brow almost comically, as he kept the damned temptation to sexually pursue other goddesses that caught his fancy in check. Forcing himself again to ignore the wide, swaying hips of his sisters, as Demeter stomped past him with Hestia following concernedly close by, no doubt to check up on their brother now that they were done fending off the siege. He and Metis really couldn't get to their chambers faster, as far as he was concerned.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video if you wanted of this series. Please comment 3 hearts for more.